1. What is a Docker container? A Docker container is a standardized unit of software that packages code and all its dependencies together. It runs on a host operating system, sharing the kernel but isolating the process space and resources. 2. What is a Docker image? A Docker image is a read-only template that contains the instructions for creating a Docker container. It includes the operating system, application code, libraries, and configuration files. 3. What is a Docker file? A Docker file is a text document that contains instructions for building a Docker image. It specifies the base image, environment variables, installation steps for dependencies, and the final command to execute when the container runs. 4. What are the benefits of using Docker? Portability. Docker containers run consistently across different environments. Isolation. Applications run in isolated containers, preventing conflicts. Reproducibility. Docker images guarantee consistent deployments. Efficiency. Containers share the host kernel, making them lightweight and fast. 5. What is the difference between a container and a VM? Containers share the kernel with the host OS, while VMs have their own virtualized kernel. This makes containers lighter and faster to start. 6. What is Docker Compose? Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container applications with Docker. It uses a YAML file, dockercompose.yaml, to describe the services, networks, and volumes needed for your application. 7. How does Docker Compose manage communication between containers? Docker Compose creates a private network by default, allowing containers defined in the same dockercompose.yaml file to communicate with each other using service names. 8. What are Docker volumes? Docker volumes are persistent storage directories that allow containers to store data that survives container restarts. Volumes are not part of the container image and are mounted at specific locations within the container. 9. How can you troubleshoot issues with Docker containers? There are various tools and techniques for troubleshooting Docker issues, including Docker logs, view container logs, Docker exec, run commands inside a container, Docker ps, list running containers, Docker inspect, get detailed information about a container. 10. How can you define environment variables in Docker Compose? You can define environment variables in the environment section of a service definition in your dockercompose.yaml file. 11. A developer hands you a Docker file with multiple run commands. How would you optimize it for better performance? Here are some optimization tips. 1. Combine multiple run commands. Group related installation steps into a single run command to reduce the number of layers in the image. 2. Use multi-stage builds. Leverage multi-stage builds to create a smaller final image by separating the build and runtime environments. 3. Cache intermediate layers. Utilize Docker's layer caching to avoid rebuilding unchanged layers during subsequent builds. 12. Explain the concept of Docker networking. Docker networking allows containers to communicate with each other and with the outside world. Docker provides various networking options, including bridge networking, host networking, overlay networking for swarm mode, and McVLAN networking. Each container typically gets its own IP address and can be accessed via ports mapped from the host or through Docker's internal network. 13. Explain the difference between Docker restart policies. No, always, and on failure. No. Containers with this restart policy will not be restarted automatically if they exit, regardless of the exit status. Always. Containers with this restart policy will always be restarted automatically, regardless of the exit status. On failure, containers with this restart policy will be restarted automatically only if they exit with a non-zero exit status, indicating a failure. 14. What is the difference between a Docker file, CMD, and entry point directive? The CMD directive in a Docker file specifies the default command to run when a container is started, and it can be overridden by providing command line arguments when running the container. The entry point directive, on the other hand, specifies the executable to run when the container starts, and any arguments provided when running the container are passed as arguments to the entry point command. 15. Types of Docker volume. Named volumes, managed by Docker, persistent, and assigned a specific name. Recommended for data persistence and easy management. Host bind mounts. Mounts a directory or file from the host file system into a container. Useful for sharing files and resources between host and container. Anonymous volumes. Automatically created by Docker if no specific volume is defined. Useful for temporary data or caching purposes. TMPFS mounts. Creates a temporary file system in memory inside the container. Suitable for storing temporary data or sensitive information without persisting it on disk. 16. What is the difference between add and copy instructions in Dockerfile? The copy instruction copies files or directories from the Docker build context, the directory containing the Docker file, into the image. The EADD instruction copies files or directories from the build context, but it also supports additional features like automatic URL retrieval and automatic unpacking of compressed files.